On today's program, former Secretary of State Henry Kissinger will discuss the state of the world. We'll have a performance by the Ball State University Pep Band, and we'll hear the views of Indiana Congressman Lee Hamilton concerning the Iran-Contra Affair. Former Secretary of State Henry Kissinger spoke on the Ball State University campus. While here, he discussed with us his thoughts on East-West relations, a possible summit in Washington. He also comments on the Mideast political situation. Dr. Kissinger, events have been moving very rapidly following the Moscow meetings on arms limitation. What do you think of Premier Gorbachev's proposal for withdrawing the short-range missiles from East Germany and Czechoslovakia?
Well, I'm not opposed to his withdrawing his missiles from East Germany and Czechoslovakia. I'm opposed to withdrawing American missiles from West Germany and Western Europe. We have to remember that the Soviets have about 90 divisions and a very strong mobilization potential. We have 16 divisions. NATO is significantly inferior in conventional strength, and for 50 years or 40 years the peace of Europe has been maintained because the Soviets faced the danger of nuclear war. We cannot let them, in the name of arms control, suddenly denuclearize Europe and get a tremendous advantage in conventional forces. If they were to disband their tank armies, if there were limitations on the number of troops they could put forward, then we might have a basis for negotiation. I hope very much that somebody says we need a certain number of conventional nuclear weapons in Europe, or we're going to all of NATO is going to go down the drain.
You think we're using the wrong approach?
No, I think frankly it was a mistake to offer. I'm not opposed to reducing weapons. I'm opposed to having no American nuclear weapons in Europe, because the problem is that the Soviet nuclear weapons get withdrawn just a few hundred miles into the Soviet Union. Ours get withdrawn thousands of miles into the United States. The Soviet Union can threaten Europe as a nation. We have to defend it as an ally. It's a psychological inequality. It is the wrong approach to go to zero.
British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher said the same thing to Premier Gorbachev last week.
She's right.
She said without the nuclear deterrent, we'd have chaos in the world.
She's right.
Okay. Do you think we'll reach some accord with this arms limitation talk?
Yes, but only if we talk like Mrs. Thatcher did.
It appears that the Reagan administration is very anxious to have a summit meeting in Washington. Are we going to sacrifice?
Too anxious.
Are we going to sacrifice something for this approach?
I hope not, and I don't see any reason to. I think that Gorbachev wants to come to Washington. I think the less we talk about it, the more likely he is to come. He knows we want that he's welcome here. Now it's up to him.
When a letter is offered to a head of state, as Secretary Shultz did this week to Premier Gorbachev to visit Washington, aren't there feelers so that there would be some accord, some positive reaction rather than an outright rejection?
Well, that's what one would expect, but he's coming. I wouldn't. He's using this to blackmail us, and he wants to use this to make sure there is some agreement that he can sign. This is one-upmanship. I will stake anything on the proposition that before the end of this year, Gorbachev will be in Washington, and I'll stake only a little less on the proposition that before the end of next year, President Reagan will be in Moscow.
Premier Gorbachev says he doesn't want this to be another stroll if he does come to Washington, referring, of course, to Reykjavik. If he does come to Washington, what kind of an accord do you foresee?
There'll be an accord on medium-range missiles that's agreed to in principle. And, you know, it's a great thing if, like Gorbachev, you can state a demand as a condition that you know is already fulfilled. It's easy to score victories that way.
Don't we view their short-range missiles as long-range missiles?
No, I view there
I mean, it's medium-range missiles.
the distinction between short-range and medium and strategic missiles depends on the number of boosters you attach to the warhead, and boosters can be added and discarded in a matter of minutes. And anyway, they are very close by. They have about 20,000 warheads altogether. So whether they withdraw a few hundred from Europe is really does not affect the European nuclear danger.
The Russians have insisted that any arms reduction be tied in with the Strategic Defense Initiative. First, what are your views?
Strategic reduction.
Yes. What is your view of the
I favor the
SDI?
Strategic Defense Initiative. I think it is inconceivable that one can live in a nuclear world and does nothing to protect one's population. That's absolutely irresponsible. And why are the Soviets so opposed to the Strategic Defense Initiative? Because it eliminates or reduces their capacity for nuclear blackmail. So I favor the Strategic Defense Initiative, and I think with goodwill it can be incorporated into negotiations in such a way that realistic progress is possible.
They want us to keep our testing within the laboratory. This is
Well,
one of the
they want us-
preconditions.
They first don't want us to deploy it, then they want to get restrictions on our testing. If we meet their conditions, it will never happen. How can you test a space defense in a laboratory? It's absurd.
Of course, they deny having tested an SDI of their own, but there are reports that they have.
Well, let's put the thing separately. Whether they have or not, we have to look after our own security. What is certainly clear is they have built an air defense system around Moscow. They have graciously agreed that we could build sensors by which you can pick up incoming missiles. That's a great thing. Since we have nothing on the ground, and since they won't let us put things in space, putting sensors into space enables them to hook up their sensors with their ground defense. So I think they are, as of now, ahead of us in strategic defense. If we worked at it hard, because it's high technology, we would certainly get ahead of them. I am not bothered by the fact of being ahead of the Soviets in something. It's a peculiar notion that that it is bad for us to be ahead.
Apparently, we must be making some strides because they are nervous about the SDI initiative.
They surely would not keep pressing it. But I'm not saying that we should just go ahead without being willing to negotiate. I do say we cannot give them a veto over our deployments.
There appears to be a new spirit of cooperation coming out of Moscow, and you recently spent 3 hours with Premier Gorbachev. How did you size up the man, and what direction do you think the negotiations between our two countries would
I think
take?
he's a brilliant man. He's a different type from any we have seen before. I think, however, that we have to judge him by what he does in foreign policy, not by what he does in domestic policy. And I do not yet in foreign policy see any sign of any major change in his policy. The proposals he's been making are to the Soviet advantage.
The Nuclear Proliferation Treaty expires in 8 years. What do you foresee when this happens?
Well, it's hard to foresee now, but I hope it will be renewed.
Do you think it will be renewed?
I think there'll be many pressures not to renew it.
How many countries in the world do you think now have the bomb? Do you think South Africa, Israel, and Pakistan have the bomb too?
I think certainly India, China, France, and Britain have the bomb. It's very possible that Israel has the bomb. It's probable that South Africa is close to it, and Pakistan is a little bit behind.
Of course, your area of expertise is worldwide, but especially in the Middle East. How do you think that we're going to come out of the Iran-Contra Affair and renew our prestige in the Middle East?
Well, I think in the Middle East, very little can be done before the end of the Reagan administration. For a president who's leaving office to get started on a Mideast negotiation when the passions are so deep, and when above all there is no clear fulcrum, no clear associate with which we can work, in my day, we had President Sadat, who was a great man with great vision, representing a big country. Right now, the man we have to work with is King Hussein, who is a fine man, very courageous, but representing a very vulnerable and exposed society. So I don't think anything significant can be done in the next year and a half.
I'd like to ask you one final question, and it's been hashed and rehashed in the past week, but that is embassy security. Did we overreact to the problem with our embassies?
Well, no, it's really hard to overreact when you face when you have an embassy that was built in part with Russian labor. There is one huge recording studio. And when you find out that the Marines, whom nobody had suspected before, had been a weak link, and that Russian KGB agents had been running around our embassy, something has to be done about assuring security, but it's our responsibility. I mean, the Russians behave like Russians, and if we can't protect ourselves, then that is importantly our own fault.
Well, I understand the Russians won't accept a load of cement in Washington for the construction of their new embassy unless they can inspect it.
Right.
Why can't we demand the same conditions in Moscow?
We absolutely should.
Ray Klein, embassy intelligence officer in the Nixon administration, said on the Ted Koppel Nightline program that he sent you a memo in 1972.
Oh, listen, everybody says they sent me memos. When you are Secretary of State, every memo gets addressed to the Secretary of State, and therefore, theoretically, it is possible. In 1972, we had the Vietnam War, we had a Middle East crisis, we had the Vietnamese offensive, we had the opening to China, we had a trip to the summit. And I wasn't Secretary of State, I was security advisor. I don't know whether his memo ever got past his own Secretary of State. And this is one of these things, whenever something goes wrong, you can always find some wise guy who said he wrote a memo. The same guy probably wrote a memo in the opposite direction too, which he doesn't surface. So the fundamental decision about the embassy, in fact, was made in the Johnson administration, not in the Nixon administration. I didn't know that myself until I started looking into the papers.
So the condition the world was in that period, construction of an embassy would have been low priority.
No, but the construction of the embassy, the basic decision was made in the Johnson administration, wasn't made in the Nixon administration. And the final agreement was signed in the Carter administration, and I bet my last cent that this was done between technicians, and nothing ever went to the White House in any administration.
Do you think we should tear down the present construction and rebuild?
This depends on what the technicians are saying. I think we have a good bargaining position, because in an agreement that was signed when I was in office, the Soviets cannot move into their embassy until we move into ours. So we should be very hard-nosed in negotiating about it.
Yeah. Thank you very much, sir. Yeah. The Ball State University Pep Band, directed by Mark Speed, performs Hip to Be Square by Huey Lewis. Indiana's 9th District Congressman Lee Hamilton is chairman of the Select Congressional Committee to investigate the Iran-Contra Affair. He talks about the committee's goals. Congressman Hamilton, Iran-Gate has been pushed off the front pages with the embassy bugging wars and the scandal regarding the Marine Guards. Do you think there will be renewed interest and public support for your congressional hearings regarding Iran-Gate?
I think we're in kind of a quiet phase now as we complete the rather painstaking investigation that's been going forward. And when the public hearings begin on May 5th, we'll see a resurgence of interest in the Iran-Gate story.
How important is this scandal? You've been in Congress many years. And how would you rate it in respect to Watergate and other national scandals?
I don't try to make comparisons. I do think this is a very serious matter. What happened in brief was that the United States was saying to all the world that we were doing one thing, when in fact we were doing quite the opposite secretly. We were telling all the world that we were following a policy of not dealing with terrorists and not making concessions to terrorists, when in fact we were doing just those things. We were telling the world that we were neutral in the war in the Gulf, when in fact we were supplying arms to one side. Now that goes to the credibility of the United States. It goes to the question of how much confidence they have in what we say. And those are serious matters for the United States.
Yet we read and hear reports from Europe that they don't attach a great deal of importance to what was done in the Iran-Gate affair.
It depends on what leaders you talk to. The United States, for example, has had a very serious disruption in its contacts with and conversations with the so-called moderate Arab countries because they no longer trust our word. Other leaders don't take it as seriously. So you get a mixed reaction in the world. But I don't think there's much doubt about the fact that the United States has been harmed internationally by this incident. That's not to the advantage of any American. We want to correct the problems that existed and move on to other matters.
Do you think there's any soundness in the policy of President Reagan in wanting to open avenues with Iran?
Oh, I think that's a good policy. I would commend the President for wanting to make an opening to this country of Iran, which has been a terrible burden for us in recent years. The difference I think I would have with the President is the means by which he chose to do that. I do not think he should have chosen the means of selling arms to Iran. I think there were a lot of other alternatives open to him to make that opening. Economic moves, diplomatic moves, that would have been preferable.
How far has your committee traced the financial aspect of this Iran?
That's really the key question. We wanted very much to get hold of the bank records. I think that would be the best evidence of what happened to the money. Unfortunately, those bank records are controlled by the Swiss government, and we've not had the cooperation we'd like in getting those bank records. So we're going to have to try to trace the records through the testimony of individuals who participated in the accounts. And I think we'll get a reasonable understanding. But I think it is important to note that with all of our media attention that has been given to this, with all of the investigation done by the Congress, we still don't know what happened to that money. And we've got tens of millions of dollars floating around, and we don't know what happened to it.
Do you know exactly how much?
No, I don't know exactly how much. I've seen the estimates. They run from 10 million to 90 million. I can't be precise about that. I don't know at this point how much is missing. Some of that money, a lot of that money, I think, belongs to the American taxpayer.
The Swiss government in recent years has relaxed some of its policy in respect to access to these records. And since the money is government money, U.S. government money, and you are representing the U.S. government in this affair, I'm surprised that they would be so adamant about opening the records to you.
Well, first, it's not just a matter of getting access, but it's how quickly you can get access. I'm told by my lawyer friends, who know a lot more about this than I do, that it takes a long time to get hold of those records, and we're, of course, under some real time constraints, so that's a factor. Secondly, this money was not money put in a U.S. account. It was money put in under the name of corporations and individuals. Now, they may have been acting as agents of the United States government. That's not crystal clear at this point. But it's not the same thing as just having U.S. government money accounts there. Lake Resources, for example, the corporation controlled one of the accounts. That's not a government corporation. That complicates our problems.
Do you think at this point that Admiral Poindexter and Colonel North will reveal this information under limited immunity?
I just don't know what Admiral Poindexter and Colonel North are going to say. I have no information on that that I consider reliable. Washington is rife with rumors about what Poindexter is saying and what North is saying, but they haven't said it to me yet. They haven't said it to our investigators, and I'm not going to try to speculate.
Not on record until they do.
That's exactly right.
Where the money went, of course, is the most important unanswered question, as you've just said. In order of importance, what are some of the other answers you'll be looking for?
Well, I think the money records and the president's knowledge, obviously, are the two critical questions that are involved. But there are very serious questions of policy process involved here. How did this policy keep going? What are the dynamics of it when the Secretary of State was against it, when the Secretary of Defense was against it, when Bud McFarlane, the National Security Advisor, got up several times from the table and said the whole effort is dead, but it kept moving forward. What are the dynamics of that? We don't really understand that very well. We've got a lot of questions about process here. Why did the process break down? How was it that a colonel on the National Security Council staff was telling the Director of Central Intelligence what to do? How was it that that colonel was calling up the President of Costa Rica and saying to him, we're going to cut your aid off? The process really broke down, and we don't understand that as well as we'd like to. And we want to make suggestions as to how that process can be strengthened.
Do you plan on calling the President to testify, and is there a precedent for presidents testifying?
At the moment, I would say it's not likely that the President would testify. There is only one precedent that I know about, and that one was when President Gerald Ford went to the Congress voluntarily on his own initiative to testify to the Congress about the reasons he gave a pardon to former President Nixon. I don't think, unless the President would choose himself to come voluntarily, that we would ask him to testify. We will see the President's private records. We may have an opportunity to talk with him about it. We'll just see how that develops. I think it's unlikely that he would testify.
When do your committee hearings begin?
May the 5th.
Let's move from the Iran-Gate scandal and the committee hearings. Your expertise in Congress is in the area of foreign affairs. And I'd like to ask your comments on the recent bugging war, and very briefly, and how it is affecting or could affect Secretary Shultz's visit and negotiations with the Russians on arms reduction.
I don't think any person who has worked closely in national security affairs should be startled by information that the Russians are bugging us or that we are bugging them. It's a part of the international scene. It's not the most pleasant aspect of international affairs, but neither should it surprise us. What the Russians did, of course, in Moscow, we simply cannot tolerate. And we must make clear to them that it's got to stop. But I don't think the dialogue between the two nations on arms control, as critically important as that is, should stop just because you have a serious problem with the Soviets on the security side. If you always wait for the perfect atmosphere in order to sit down and talk about arms control, you will never sit down to talk about arms control because there are always going to be problems between us and the Soviets.
Do you think this is that an arms reduction agreement is imminent and there's a possibility of...
I think it is possible. I think it depends on the President of the United States. Can he, in the remaining months of his presidency, overcome the disarray in his administration on arms control policy and say, and knock some heads together, if you will, and say, this is the way it's going to be? He has a chance. I believe he wants to do it. I think he's quite sincere about that. I also think Mr. Gorbachev is sincere about it, and that we have now a rare opportunity, doesn't come along very often in U.S.-Soviet relations, when both sides are prepared to move forward on arms control. I very much hope that Mr. Reagan succeeds in that effort. I think it's important for all of us that he does.